So let me discuss the other group of the hormones and related agents, that is the GnRH antagonists. Right, that is GnRH antagonists. Now, if you take the GnRH antagonists, let me tell you the examples of this particular GnRH antagonist. These includes number 1, cetrorelix. Right, the drugs under these groups include the cetrorelix. Then we have GnRH. Right, then we have GnRH. Then we have degarelix. Right, then we have degarelix, and the other drug is 𝗑𝐵𝐼𝐿𝐼𝐿. Right, the other drug is 𝗑𝐵𝐼𝐿𝐼. Okay, so these are your GnRH antagonists, that is cetrorelix, GnRH, degarelix and 𝗑𝐵𝐼𝐿𝐼. Remember, these are the antagonists of the luteinizing hormone releasing hormone. Right, these are antagonists of luteinizing hormone releasing hormone. Now, the important point is that these drugs, they will decrease the release of the gonadotrophins without causing initial stimulation. Now, just now we have discussed about the GnRH agonist. What did we discuss? That they will cause the transient release and followed by that inhibition. Whereas these drugs, they will decrease the release of gonadotrophins without causing initial stimulation. So the point is, there is no initial stimulation. Right, the point is, there is no initial stimulation of the release of the gonadotrophins by this GnRH antagonists. Now let me tell you about the important drug, that is degarelix. Remember, this particular degarelix has been approved for the treatment of the prostatic carcinoma without the risk of flare-up reaction. That is an important point. So if you take this particular degarelix, this particular degarelix has been approved for the treatment of prostatic carcinoma. Right, has been approved for the treatment of prostatic carcinoma, right, without the flare-up reaction. So this is about your GnRH antagonist. Now, next to the GnRH antagonist, we have another important group of drugs. They are called as the antiestrogens. Now let me discuss about this another group, that is antiestrogens. Now, if you take this antiestrogens, the drugs under this particular antiestrogens, they include Tamoxifen and as well as toxicities. Right, Tamoxifen and as well as the other drug is toxicities. So Tamoxifen and as well as toxicities, these are selective estrogen receptor modulators. Right, these are selective estrogen receptor modulators. Right, and the point is, this Tamoxifen and as well as toxicities, they are useful for chemo prevention as well as the treatment of both early stage and as well as metastatic breast carcinoma. So basically, remember, these two drugs, they are used in the treatment of the breast carcinoma. So which all phases of breast carcinoma these drugs are used? These are used for chemo prevention. Right, these are useful for chemo prevention, that is preventing the onset of the breast carcinoma. So these are useful for chemo prevention, and as well as they are useful as well as the treatment of both, right, treatment of both early stage and metastatic, right, metastatic breast carcinoma. So basically these two drugs are used in the treatment of breast carcinoma. Now let me tell you an important point about these particular Tamoxifen and toxicities. Now the advantage of this particular degarelix was there was no initial stimulation, there is no initial flare, but you take these drugs Tamoxifen and as well as toxicities, these can lead to transient flare-up reaction. They can also have the menopausal symptoms and other estrogenic adverse effects. So the point is, these two drugs can lead to transient flare-up reaction. Right, they can lead to transient flare-up reaction, and they can also have, right, they can also have the menopausal symptoms and other estrogenic adverse effects. Right, and other estrogenic adverse effects. Now see, these are the antiestrogens, that is selective estrogen receptor modulators. Whereas now let me tell you another important selective estrogen receptor downregulator. They are called as SERD, that is selective estrogen receptor downregulators. The examples of these particular drugs are Fulvestrant, right? The examples are Fulvestrant. Now, if you take this particular Fulvestrant, remember it is a pure estrogen receptor antagonist, right? This is a pure estrogen receptor antagonist. All right. Now, what is the advantage of this particular Fulvestrant is it is having improved safety profile, faster onset and longer duration of action, right? This Fulvestrant, remember a point, it has improved safety profile, right? It has improved safety profile and it also has faster onset of action and it has, right, and it has longer duration of action. This is the advantage of the Fulvestrant: improved safety profile, faster onset of action and as well as the longer duration. Next, the other important point is this particular Fulvestrant, remember it is indicated for metastatic breast cancer, right? It is indicated for metastatic breast cancer. So that is about the anti-estrogens. So let me shortly revise here. You take the GnRH antagonists. The GnRH antagonists, the example they include cetrorelix, then ganirelix, degarelix and as well as the 𝐒𝐵𝐼𝐻. These are the antagonists of the luteinizing hormone releasing hormone. And these drugs, remember, they will decrease the release of the gonadotrophins without causing initial stimulation. And the very important drug is degarelix. Degarelix has been approved for the treatment of the prostatic carcinoma without the risk of flare-up reactions. Next, you take the anti-estrogens, that is tamoxifen and as well as 𝗏𝐴. These are selective estrogen receptor modulators that are useful for the chemo prevention as well as the treatment of both early stage and metastatic breast carcinoma. And the point is, these can lead to transient flare-up reaction, menopausal symptoms and other estrogenic adverse effects. So these are the adverse effects of these particular drugs. And we have what is called as another group of drugs, that is selective estrogen receptor downregulators. The example is like we have what is called Fulvestrant. Fulvestrant, it is a pure estrogen receptor antagonist. It is having improved safety profile, faster duration, faster onset and longer duration of action. And this particular drug is indicated in case of the metastatic breast cancer. Now let me discuss the other group of drugs which are used in case of malignancies, that is aromatase inhibitors. Now let me tell you what exactly is your aromatase, like what is its useful in a human being. Remember, aromatase is an enzyme which is responsible for the conversion of androstenedione to the estrone. Now if you take this particular aromatase, it is an enzyme which is responsible for the conversion of the androstenedione to estrone, right? Androstenedione to estrone. Now you take this androstenedione. Androstenedione, it is an androgen precursor, right? This is your androgen precursor, all right? Whereas you take the estrone. Estrone is your estrogenic hormone, right? It is your estrogenic hormone. Next, now let me tell you, there are certain group of drugs which will inhibit this particular aromatase. So aromatase is being inhibited by certain group of drugs, and these particular drugs, they include aminoglutamide, anastrozole, exemestane and then letrozole. These are the drugs which are acting as aromatase inhibitors, and these are classified according to the generations. So we have first generation aromatase inhibitor, second generation aromatase inhibitor and third generation aromatase inhibitor. Now let me tell you those particular drugs. So coming to the first generation, right, first generation aromatase inhibitors. So if you take the first generation aromatase inhibitors, these particular drugs, they include, that is aminoglutamide. Right, these particular drugs, they include aminoglutamide. Next to this particular aminoglutamide, remember we have the second generation. So if you take the second generation drugs, we have formistane, fedrazole, and then roglitimide. Okay, so second generation aromatase inhibitors, they include formistane, right, formistane, and the other drug like what we have is fedrazole, right, the other drug what we have is the fedrazole, and then the other drug what we have is roglitimide, right, the other drug what we have is the roglitimide. So these are your second generation aromatase inhibitors, and as well we have the third generation aromatase inhibitors. So if you take the third generation aromatase inhibitors, they include 𝐒𝐮𝐵, right, they include 𝐒𝐮𝐵. Then we have other drug that is anastrozole, right, the other drug that is anastrozole. Then we have letrozole and as well as vorozole, right, letrozole and as well as the vorozole. So remember, these are your third generation aromatase inhibitors. Now, where are these particular group of drugs used? Remember, aromatase inhibitors are useful in case of the advanced breast carcinoma, right, useful in the management of advanced breast carcinoma. Now, you take the adverse effects of these particular drugs. The adverse effects, they include hot flushes, arthralgia, and as well as fatigue. Right, it includes hot flushes, arthralgia, and as well as fatigue. Alright, so these are the adverse effects of these drugs. Now you take this drug that is aminoglutamide. Remember, aminoglutamide also causes adrenal insufficiency and myelosuppression. So this is an important point about the aminoglutamide. This aminoglutamide, at a point of time, this was used in case of Cushing's, where there was corticosteroid excess. But because of its myelosuppressive action, this aminoglutamide was put aside in treatment of Cushing's. Okay, so this aminoglutamide, remember, this will also cause the adrenal suppression. Right, not only adrenal suppression, this will also cause the myelosuppression. Right, this will also cause the myelosuppression. So this is completely about your aromatase inhibitors. So remember, aromatase is the enzyme which is required for the conversion of the androstenedione to the estrone. You take androstenedione, it is an androgen precursor. You take the estrone, it is an estrogenic hormone. Now, these aromatase inhibitors, we classify them into first generation, second generation, and third generation. First generation aromatase inhibitors, they include aminoglutamide. Second generation is your formistane and as well as the fedrazole and roglitimide. The third generation, they include 𝐒𝐮𝐵, anastrozole, letrozole, and as well as vorozole. And if you take these aromatase inhibitors, they are useful in case of advanced breast carcinoma. And the adverse effects of these particular drugs include the hot flushes, arthralgia, and as well as fatigue. And aminoglutamide, remember, it also causes adrenal insufficiency and as well as myelosuppression. Now, let me tell you the selected toxicities of the hormonal agents. So, we have discussed various hormonal agents used in the treatment of malignancies. Now, I will summarize the toxicities of all the hormonal agents what we are using in the treatment of malignancies, right? So first and foremost, you take the very important drug that is flutamide. The toxicity associated with the flutamide is it can cause the hot flushes and as well as liver dysfunction, right? It can cause hot flushes and as well as the liver dysfunction. Next, you take the other group of drugs that is selective estrogen receptor modulators. Now, if we see the selective estrogen receptor modulators, the adverse effects associated with these drugs include number one, menopausal symptoms, right? Menopausal symptoms, and the other adverse effects are, right? The other adverse effects are the fluid retention. Next is, right? Next we have thromboembolism and as well as increased incidence of endometrial cancer. right? Increased incidence of the endometrial cancer. So if you take the other drugs, that is progestins, these progestins, they can cause, right, or they will cause the fluid retention. Next, you take the other group of drugs, that is corticosteroids, right? The other group of drugs, that is corticosteroids. Remember, this particular corticosteroids, they can cause fluid retention, right? They can cause fluid retention, and these particular drugs, they can cause hypertension, right? They can also cause diabetes mellitus and increased susceptibility to infections, right? Increased susceptibility to infections. So these are your corticosteroids and as well as their adverse effects. Now we have other group of drugs, that is GnRH agonists. Now you take this GnRH agonist, right? So the adverse effects of these particular drugs, they include the transient flare-up reactions, hot flushes, impotency, gynecomastia and osteoporosis. So they can have transient flare-up, right, hot flushes, right, and they can also have the gynecomastia, right? They can also cause gynecomastia, impotency, and as well as, right, as well as the osteoporosis. Next, like we have other drug, that is aminoglutamide. Aminoglutamide, the very important adverse effect is it can cause, right, it can cause myelosuppression, and it will also cause adrenal suppression or adrenal insufficiency. Next, you take the other group of drugs, that is aromatase inhibitors, right? Aromatase inhibitors. So if you take these aromatase inhibitors, these aromatase inhibitors can cause fatigue, right? These drugs can cause hot flushes, and these drugs can also cause arthralgias. So these are the adverse effects associated with the various hormonal agents which we are using in the treatment of malignancies.